I myself am only like starting to think about these issues and how like the philosophy of mind can help with thinking about AI. And so the general questions I'll be asking, I think they'll be on the next slide, is what can the philosophy of mind offer to the AI risk space? So what kind of like conceptual clarifications, for example, can it give us? And what are the downstream effects of that? And I tend to bracket the questions into two. One is, does AI really have a mind? Which is a question that is on a lot of people's minds, no pun intended. And the separate question of, regardless of whether or not AI has a mind, what kind of effects might there be on our psychology or um, our social or cultural environment if we talk as if AI um, has a mind? So we kind of do this all the time. We sort of routinely talk about um, AIs as if they're minded. I think in the next few slides give like examples of this, but there's no real. I think it's pretty uncontroversial, right, to all of us that we talk today as if AIs have mind. We say that Claude can reason, ChatGPT can think. We claim that it understands things, et cetera, et cetera. And there's sort of a broader question of like what the stakes of actually doing that are. So, for example, a very simple example, a Reuters Institute survey published in October 2025 asked users why they trust AI generated information. And a lot of them said that, initially they'll trust it for like a first glance because AI knows a lot more than a human being. And of course, this raises a philosophical question. At the same time, you can sort of understand it as raising a philosophical question or not. Like the vast majority of people probably just mean the AI has ingested a bunch of information, a lot more information than you or I could ingest in a lifetime. And so it knows more things, and we could use that in a sort of mundane way. But it also raises a broader question of what knowledge really is and what it means to know something. And I think there's kind of interesting questions that lie at the intersection of this issue with, what psychologists are finding out and what other people who are like working in the AI space are doing. Um, so I've kind of split the talk into two problems. This will be, I think, a few slides ahead. One I've called the evidence problem, which is that I think we fundamentally don't have right enough evidence to suggest that AIs are minded. Though a lot of people in the AI space are making arguments for this claim, I think it's worth understanding that in order to kind of take that as a serious empirical question, you do have to first be willing to digest and absorb a lot of philosophical background that the average person, the ordinary person, or you or I might not be willing to accept. So I personally don't sort of accept the broader philosophical question or framework that sits behind these questions. But very often, what happens in the media is that they are sort of it's presented as if this kind of philosophical framework is uncontroversial. And so I think it's worth making clear that that's kind of not the case. So I've given a list sort of some papers that have either claimed recently that AI is conscious, or which I consider to be sort of on a roughly the same scale. There is no reason that in the future, with added complexity, it won't become conscious. And this is based on I can't get into the details here, but it is something I write about on Substack. A lot of people are interested. This is based on a theoretical framework called functionalism, which very roughly argues that a sufficiently complex computational system has a mind. That's the argument. It's the mind is just some sufficiently complex input-output system, and if you have that, we all have it in our brains, but there's no principled reason that AIs don't have it. And I think, I'm trying to think at the moment about like what risks this might pose in like practical terms on an everyday basis. And I think one good example is that believing that resemblance of outputs is sufficient for underlying mental states. So if you do accept that functionalism is roughly true, then you might be tempted to think that sufficiently complex outputs is enough for the machine to have a mind. So for example, when an AI spits out a response to you that shows that it so it gave you the information, we'll say, that you found accurate or that you wanted, people might be tempted to say, oh yeah, the AI understood my question, which is a further like step. And I think requires philosophy and not just science. Um, so here's, I think, one example is if this is on the slides, called Mata versus Avianca. So this was just a 2023 lawsuit. As far as I'm aware, this is happening a lot. But to me, it was just an interesting case of how we might behave, like socially and culturally, if we think that AIs understand things. So there was a personal injury lawsuit filed against Avianca, and the plaintiff's lawyer submitted, hallucinated legal briefs. So this was legal briefs that the AI just made up. And when he was asked, the sort of interesting psychological or philosophical evidence, I think, is that when the lawyer was asked to check his cases, he went back to ChatGPT and he asked the ChatGPT to verify the cases. But of course, you shouldn't or wouldn't ask this question to ChatGPT unless you really thought that the ChatGPT had some demonstrated ability to do something like fact check, in a sort of robust human sense, in the same way that human beings can tell the difference between right or wrong, does something exist or not exist. The lawyer was sort of making that assumption with AI. And to me, that kind of represents a clear case of thinking that sufficiently complex outputs is in fact demonstration of understanding. Now I put I read through this like the judge's document on this case, and rightly the judge pointed out all of the sort of economic and social and time costs that went into the fact that the case submitted a bunch of hallucinated documents. You're wasting time, you're wasting money, you're wasting the court's time. Clients could be deprived of actual arguments that could help them in their case. So you can kind of see there that it might seem sort of irrelevant, like the philosophy behind it. But I think the very ways in which we have absorbed what AI is today actually do subtly rely on a lot of philosophical work that's not always made obvious. So then I just have, I think it's the next slide, some broader downstream effects of what I'm calling the evidence problem. So I think a big one is what I've called structural blindness, namely, you see this all the time. Like people say that AI's errors, like what we call an error, right, gets diagnosed as a mistake that can be fixed rather than just a structural feature of the system. So arguably, the AIs as they are currently constructed are not the kind of systems that know what right and wrong is. They're not really the kind of systems that can make mistakes. Like a mistake is something that you can make if you're capable of getting something right. But what does it mean to get something right for an AI system? I think that's sort of an open question. So to me, it would be a lot clearer to kind of diagnose these issues as just like structural features of the model, rather than to view them as mistakes. Another would be overclaiming, right? So like if we think that AIs genuinely understand things, then I think we risk using AIs in places where arguably they are not fit to be used. Of course, people will disagree over, where AI is fit to be used and where it's not. I think examples one at least controversial enough case would be, for example, using AI therapists. But I'm sure there's more cases in the workplace of, where there should be a lot more perhaps human judgment than there currently is. And another one could be governance blindness, right? So like if you think of the AI model as the kind of as an agent of some form or something that's capable of understanding, you might not put up the right guardrails. You might not be protecting the whatever it is you're trying to do. The model itself may be ill-fitted to do it because we haven't put in the right constraints, because we're understanding the model to be something that it is not. So I think those are the sort of broader downstream effects of what are ultimately do come from, I think, a philosophical base or issue. Another then is what I'm calling the deception problem. So this will be on the next slide. Yes. So there is a separate question, and there's a lot of interesting research coming out on this as to, there's many people who will say, look, I don't think AI has a mind, but I talk as if it does from time to time. And I think like I'm guilty of this, right? I do this all the time. But there is a question as to whether or not this can actually have negative impacts. And the reason I thought of it is because There is research that has come out, for instance, showing that the more human-like an AI seems, so the more human-like characteristics it has, the more we tend to ascribe consciousness to it. And Gunrick and Grisano are just one example. I think there is more research on this. But one of the most interesting results is that these effects are often implicit. So you may say, for example, you may report, oh no, I don't think the AI is conscious, or like I don't think it understands, whatever, whatever. But it may be the case that your brain is actually activating some sort of mental model. It's what they call mental models in their work. Maybe activating the kinds of mental models that get um, activated when you engage with a human being, for example. And so there's a question of whether or not we can fully discard those kinds of implicit effects when we are engaging with AIs if we continue to anthropomorphize AIs and speak of them as agents or entities. And we do this all the time, like AI agents, et cetera, et cetera. For philosophy, the word agent has a highly specific meaning. It'll be debated what an agent is, right? But in the AI space, we tend to do that less. But of course, all of us have an understanding of what these kinds of words mean. And our understanding of them is very sort of naturally mixed in with cultural and social assumptions. And so there is a question as to how um, whether or not these effects could have a negative impact. Um, so one example I have, it's on a slide called the concrete case. One example from 2023 was so these authors basically like studied people's behaviors towards AIs, and I also see this in my students. Um, they report, a lot of people will report being polite to AI chatbots, like saying please, thank you, praising the AI chatbot. But if you ask them why, they can't really they can't really explain it. They might say something like, "Oh, it never hurts to be kind." Sure, but there does seem to be, and the point here is not to judge doing that. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with doing it, but the question is there something being induced in us when we engage with something that appears so human-like? For example, has such language fluency that we should be aware of, so that we can act accordingly and sort of um, have the relevant guardrails up and in place when we are dealing with these kinds of issues. Because these people who are, being polite to their AI and all, a lot of them will report that they don't think the AI is conscious. And so there's kind of a tension there. Why do we speak to an AI as if it is conscious if we also don't think it is conscious? Well, it might be that there are sort of like implicit effects going on that we're not immediately aware of. And so Peter Reimer and West wrote this, for example, in this study. They said when users cannot tell the difference between human interlocutors and AI systems, threats emerge of deception, manipulation, and disinformation at scale. And they essentially suggest that we have to engage with anthropomorphic agents across design, development, deployment, use, regulation, et cetera. So the point here would be that we might think that it's sort of harmless to describe AIs in terms of anthropomorphic language. But at the end of the day, when we use this kind of language, we are employing and inciting in our own minds heavy concepts that, people will spend like their whole lives in philosophy debating what it means and how we can understand it and who it applies to and whatever, or what it applies to. And the latent effects of that, if we don't recognize that as a structural issue, might be problematic. So some downstream effects could include trust miscalibration. So maybe you will start to rely on systems in contexts where that reliance is either dangerous or unhelpful. Accountability gaps. So I have on the next slide actually an example of accountability. It's slightly separate from what I've just been saying, but there can be, I think, accountability gaps when we use like conceptually vague language around AI models, and something like emotional harm. So an example of an accountability gap, this was a very simple case. And Air Canada lost the case. This was from 2024. So essentially there was a client, right? They went on to Air Canada's chatbot. They asked about bereavement fares. The chatbot gave them false information, told them that they could apply for a bereavement fare, namely a reduction in their fare due to a bereavement after the fact, like after they had taken their flight. But then when the client went to to get that bereavement reimbursement, the Air Canada agent, like a human agent, told them that this was not true and that the information was false. And Air Canada's legal team argued that they were not responsible for what the chatbot said, because the chatbot was a separate legal entity and responsible for its own actions. So here, I mean, this is just my own personal take, which is on the next slide. I highly doubt the legal team thought that the AI right had a mind, but they're arguably exploiting right conceptual ambiguity here to evade liability, right? So it's convenient. It's also something you can say, and it's genuinely not clear, right? It's genuinely not clear based on how we talk about AIs in our society today, whether or not the AI is responsible for its own actions. And so if we don't sort of tighten our guardrails around these issues, I think this is like evading liability for companies is probably one of the bigger issues that we may face in terms of economic social consequences. And again, I think kind of understanding where that comes from and bringing that together from the perspective of philosophy could actually be very, very helpful in helping us downstream. Um, so that's pretty much all I have. The last slide is just sort of an overview of what I think the philosophy of mind could offer. So I do think that some of the most dangerous assumptions in AI are not necessarily technical; they are conceptual. And I don't really think we take those seriously enough today. Um, Part of the reason I think is that there are a lot of philosophers who will disagree with me. Like I should say, my views in my own field, um, debating functionalism and all of that, is by no means universally held. But there are also a lot of philosophers who would kind of contest these issues. And so even making just the general public aware of the fact that this is not like uncontroversial territory, I think is kind of important. So I think the philosophy of mind can help us sort of identify those kinds of assumptions. And I also at least hope that philosophy of mind could offer us some rigorous frameworks to try and evaluate AI consciousness claims. So I did actually recently, I put it on the slide, on the further resources slide, I write a Substack AI without minds where I kind of discuss these issues. And I also built out a little evaluation framework that people can use. So this is essentially a tool where you can, copy and paste in a portion of a text that claims of a paper that claims AI is conscious, and it will sort of evaluate how seriously we should take that claim. Now, of course, it is based on these kind of assumptions that I believe to be true, and I have argued for them on my Substack. But yeah, if people are interested in looking at that, they are free to do so. But yeah, that is all I have. Thank you so much for having me.